Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all doing? Thank you so much. This is a great turnout. Thanks for supporting the lecture this morning. Will you please welcome with Shanghai, new and old, and we will get there eventually, the fantastic Captain Richard Heyman.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see so many of you up and about. And usually at this time of day, I'm competing with people lying around the pool in the sunshine. So, well, we are confined to not to quarters, but to indoors today, which is good because this is the kind of storm that you'd rather read about than have to battle like we are. But as the captain said, this is the safest ship as has ever been built, and I personally have been through a few of these storms, and they just get more fun every time. And by the way, I did bring along some traditional Chinese medicine if you have run out of Dramamine. In Xiamen yesterday, I bought some what they call dragon eyes, which are big lychees. Actually, they're white fruit with a seed in, but then they can peel them, and they're nice and sweet. So if anybody feels a little queasy, come and help yourself. Don't eat them whole, though. Yeah. Anyway, it's a great experience to be out at sea, and of course, it makes the land seem even more charming when we get there. And we are coming around the points of the South China coast. Pardon me while we dance. And we will be coming up into the Yangzi River Delta to the great city of Shanghai. And I'm going to show you parts of this city because it is, first of all, the largest city of China with over 20 million people in its metropolitan area and about 100 million people in the wider province of Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces there are. And then it is also the place where the new and the old are best in contrast. Now, we've already been Hong Kong, which is mostly all new with very little old in it, and then Xiamen is a smaller city, which I hope you enjoyed. But Shanghai is truly fantastic, and many of you probably have been there numerous times, or if it's your first time, get ready to have your eyes widened by this tremendous city that has turned itself into a whole new place in the last couple of decades. Now, I originally came in 1980 to Shanghai, and it was still in its sort of frozen in time that nothing had happened since the 1930s. And now they're having a struggle to preserve remnants of the old and then build this tremendous new city that you'll appreciate. But let me just show you where we're going, and pardon if I sit down on the job here, because otherwise I might sit down on one of your laps there. So just fasten your seatbelts, put your tray tables up, and sit back, and here we go. Now this area is the Yangtze River Valley is right there, and it goes up, the river goes up almost 3,500 miles up to Tibet, but this is the great delta area, which is mostly flat mudland. And of course, we're coming down from the south around a number of these bays and offshore islands, and then up into the Yangtze River Valley right there at the delta. Here's a navigation map with the channels coming in, and Shanghai is not actually on either the shore or on the Yangtze, which is very large. It's about 27 miles wide at its mouth, and you cannot see land when you're on the river. It's all a big brown delta water, sort of like the Mississippi, except it has about 10 times the volume of the Mississippi River, only matched by the Amazon and the Congo. And Shanghai is in this area on a tributary called the Huangpu River, which is secluded from storms and the shore action, but it is a major port, of course. Now this is, again, Shanghai's up here on the Huangpu, and then you can see that this whole area is laced with lakes and especially canals. And this is an area of the delta land where there's really many places more water than there is land. And then on the south side, you have this great Hangzhou Bay. Now, it used to be in historical times that Shanghai was a little shore town, and then all of these classical cities of Hangzhou, Suzhou, Changzhou, they were the inland cities that are still, they date back many thousands of years, and Shanghai is a new city. Now, I have this illustration here just to show you this great bay because one of the many projects in China that you can see, this is one of the world's largest bridges that was just built. It's 36 kilometers. It's about 21 miles over this bay, and it has a great tower in the center where the road has actually they built it so it curves so the drivers won't fall asleep. They always are going over a hill or around a bend on this great sweeping bridge. And then they have a rest area and then restaurants and karaoke clubs on the bridge, so if you want to stop and enjoy the view, you can. But this is an example how big they're building things in China. This is a little satellite view of the city of Shanghai, which is up past this island called Chongming, and then we will go up the Huangpu River down into the center of the city. Now, at the city center, it is on this sweeping S-curves of the Huangpu River, which gives it two banks. The old city's on the west, and then the new Pudong section's on the east side of it. It used to be the east was all rice paddies and docks and shipyards. Now it is the great new Pudong New area. Up here a little closer, we will be docking right there at the steamship pier. And that is a very convenient dockage because you can walk right off the ship into the center of town and then down onto the Bund, which is the former, let's say, dockage for shipping. The Bund is an Anglo-Indian term for the waterfront, not a Chinese name. But it is where all of the classical banks and Western architecture are. And then across the river in Pudong are the new buildings. And then there's dense cities all through the vast area of Shanghai with many different roads. It's a sort of a grid-like city that extends out for very extensive areas. Now we are going to be coming through and seeing this sort of a site as we get in. It is a very big shipbuilding center. They've now laid out the world's biggest shipbuilding docks on the outside on the Yangzi, and also are building one of the biggest deep water ports out to sea, so the very largest of ships will not even come into Shanghai anymore. But you'll see a lot of traffic, and we go through a very let's say crowded waterway to get right downtown. Many major ships don't come up the river anymore because they're just getting too big, and little guys have to watch out. If we were on a much larger cruise ship, they all have to now dock outside of the city, and then it's almost an hour and a half bus ride to get into town. So I was on one large ship, and we docked out here, and you can see it's that sort of industrial cargo terminals which don't have much charm, but the economy is booming so much, some ship left so fast it forgot its cargo. And I hope that wasn't your shipment that is delayed, but things are sort of heated up in the industry, especially shipping in China. But as you go into town, most of the shipyards are now being replaced by parks and new office towers. This is the great Jinmao Tower, which you might go visit. And so even just a few years ago, right downtown, they were still laying together big ships, but most of that has been moved out of town to try to open up the land for development and then make it a more pleasant city also. The waterfronts were traditionally not exactly the nicest part of town, in Shanghai especially. But now this is the construction of the great new international financial building, which will be the largest in China at about 120 stories, and that's under construction now. The symbol of the city in recent decades has been this great Oriental tower, the Pearl of the Orient TV tower, which has rotating restaurants and a few attractions in it, but it looks like it landed from some Star Wars movie. Now it's being dwarfed by all the other construction. There was not that much of a city before Shanghai became a treaty port in the 1840s, and there are a few remnants of some historical buildings in the old Chinese Quarter, which used to be Wall City. This is the famous Yuyuan Garden, the tea house with the crooked bridge, and then the rooftops of the traditional tile were the model for the willow pattern of porcelain ware. And if you go to the old town, Chinese town, you'll go into this garden, which has the classic rockeries and the kind of trees and adornments. But one thing a Chinese garden doesn't have are planted flowers. They have blooming cherry trees and seasonal ornamentation. But especially this garden is the rocks that are from the local lake of Lake Tai that are limestone, put in the water for decades, and the water makes holes all through them. Then they bring them up and put them as a centerpiece in a garden so that, and in the quiet of a day, they'll light incense so that the smoke will wander through the rock, and that's an amusement for a Chinese garden. But this is surrounded by the big city and one of the residences of the Yu family. This was built in the late 1400s and is the oldest historical building in Shanghai. They have taken down the city walls and made this area, though, a traditional shopping area. So it is a lot of little alleyways, dumpling shops, workshops, of course, a lot of shopping all over Shanghai. But if you go there on the shuttle, the ship will have a shuttle from the dock right into the Old Town, which is across the business district and through many of the more modern shopping areas like Nanjing Road to the Old Town, where it's much more, let's say, flavorful as a Chinese city. There's also a few temples in that area. You may also go see the Jade Buddha Temple, which is, it used to be closed down. It has been recently reopened, and then Buddhism has been, let's say, revived quite a bit in recent decades. So you will see active ceremonies. There are monks there. The feature of that temple, though, is this great Jade Buddha, which is a Burmese jade effigy that was given to China many hundred years ago and ended up in Shanghai, and is a model of lying down when you're feeling seasick, I guess, if the Buddha feels that way. But Shanghai used to look more like this if you don't look at the apartment blocks. It is in this part of East China which is waterborne and full of agricultural lands, surrounded by canals, and the canal traffic is what would bring in all of the goods from East China to Shanghai to get on the big ships to go out to sea. And the name of Shanghai literally means to the sea. And so you'll see all this traffic coming in the creeks and down the rivers. And then if you go back into the countryside and let's say the typical life of this area, you'll have more houses on the water, canals and water taxis as the normal way of life. There is a tour to this town which is called Zhujiajiao, and that is on the ancient water town, it's called, on the ship's tour. But I recommend that if you want to see truly traditional life in China. Some of these towns have been affected by the industrialization, but some are well preserved, and this one of Zhujiajiao has been made a sanitary town, meaning that they have better facilities, so the waters are not quite as pungent as most of the other towns, and there's good food and services for visitors, including these little sampans that you can take a ride on. And so this is, let's say, cleaned up for visitors, so it isn't let's say, have the hazards of traveling on your own in parts of China. You can get quite ill from even the food or the water. But this place is pretty clean and tidy and has been decorated and preserved. Some of these towns have knocked down areas of them and built a factory. Now, this town did not have that happen, and it's only about an hour outside of central Shanghai. It's officially part of the city, but it's a beautiful town and an example of what Shanghai looked like before it turned into a modern international city. So you have the moon bridges, the arches, and then a lot of people living in the houses actively busy with their commerce or their trade. And you can see little scenes like here. Here's the old rice cooker that was made into a pot for the bean plant crawling up the house. And then it was guarded by this tiger, which didn't let us get too close to the house. But this is where you can see a little intimate life in China, including this lady who's wondering where all these strange people have come from. But it's a beautiful town, and very different from, let's say, the hustle and bustle of the big traffic in the big city. So it has no automobiles in its center area, which is a rarity in most Chinese towns. It is also the area where they grow a lot of silk, and mulberry leaves are fed to the silkworms, and then they're reeled in many towns in this area, and this is a delicate job to try to reel off the silk. And there is, again, one of the trips you go to this factory, see how they do it, and then, of course, the factory turns into a rather large shop. But silk is one of the great products of this area and reason why Shanghai was built up. There's also in this town of Zhujiajiao and also in Shanghai neighborhoods, you'll see various temples that have been rebuilt and restored. A lot of them were closed or destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, but are now reopened in the site of many devout worship. This one is a Taoist temple with the Father and Mother of Heaven, the Yin and the Yang effigies, and then a lot of other blessings that are given, particularly for good fortune. Here's a man in that village that is a fortune teller with the I Ching, and he'll cast your luck with them and see your fate as a fortune teller. The street life in Shanghai is especially famous for its, let's say, snacks on the street, which we know that in Cantonese is dim sum. That's Cantonese for what they'll call dianxing, is the name here. But it just means a little snack that you walk around and eat, sort of the original fast food. So this woman was making something called chou tofu, which is boiled fried tofu, but it sort of smells like a version of Limburger cheese mixed with somebody's old socks. And if you smell it, you'll never forget it. But they love the flavor of it, but if you get a whiff of it, that's what it is. It's not my socks. Anyway, this is a beautiful area outside of Shanghai. If you ever come back, you can take a cruise on the little canal boats on the Grand Canal. Go to Lake Tai, which is just west of Shanghai, where they still have the last fleet of sailing junks that are allowed to net a certain kind of freshwater fish, which is a delicacy in the area. But this lake of tranquility is surrounded by endless cities and endless villages, so it's quite a rarity to get a view like that in modern China. Now this is old China, which is an illustration when the Europeans first came and they met the Mandarin. Again, you can tell by their kind of conical hats that they are the officials from the north who then set themselves up to manage the Qing dynasty, which was led from Beijing, of course. And so when the Opium Wars, particularly first the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and everybody else came, they were met with resistance by the Chinese. And this is Shanghai's old city wall and gate. It was not a very big town, but like all other Chinese cities, it had armed guards and then a city gate that would be closed at night, and you had to have a permit to go in and out. And it was typical of the kind of conservative and walled, almost medieval quality of China at that time. And then out in the countryside, you had temples and canals. As I say, this was a temple that was out in the city of Shanghai, but it's been destroyed many centuries ago, back or rather than mid-1800s. But when the Europeans came and here, British redcoats are negotiating with the Manchurian officials to open Shanghai and make it a open port for trade, they then established consulates and trading houses and made Shanghai what it is today over the rapid industrialization during the 18 and 1900s to the present day. But when the foreigners were set up in Shanghai and the other treaty ports, including Xiamen and Dalian and Canton, they had what is called extraterritoriality, and they were not subject to Chinese law. They could have their own national law, whether they're English, Japanese, German. And in this illustration from a Chinese paper, a foreigner's running down a local on the street and then just kept going, and whoever protests, it was of no use because the foreigners sort of had this, what was considered a semi-colonial status in Shanghai and the rest of China. And so outside of the old Chinese town came all of the foreign trading vessels with their marines, and they set up their encampments, and they had their, let's say, bite out of China and began trade. Now this happens to be a wreck between two Jardine Matheson steamers in the 1850s on the Huangpu. You see one of them is sinking there, and that was newsworthy of the time. But when the international trade came by sea, navigation aids were put out on the Yangzi, and particularly there's a light called the Wusong light right at the entrance of the Huangpu River, which we will pass, and that's a very big beacon at this point. But right downtown they put up signal navigational towers, of which one of them still exists. This is right on the Bund, and that's the old signal tower for shipping coming up the river. Now it's a historic artifact since ships now have other ways to communicate. But the city was cut up into different concessions. So there was the original walled Chinese city in the center on the banks of the river. Then there was the French concession just north of that. Then the international concession above that, which was mostly British. And then German, Japanese, everybody came in. The U.S. government policy of open door meant that the United States commercial interests demanded to have equal access, if not actual territory, in Shanghai and other treaty ports of China. So this sort of laid out the city as we know it today, because if you go into the French Quarter, there's still some beautiful mansions. The Bund still has all of the major old banks that were set up, and then other parts of the city were mostly Chinese residents or industrialized. This is the Suzhou Creek, which is the main tributary of the Huangpu going out to the Yangzi, and we are docking within walking distance of this, the Garden Bridge it was called, built in 1905, and it linked the sides of this creek and then provided access to grow the city out beyond its original Chinese area. This is the bridge. It's there today. You can walk across it. And behind it is what they call the Broadway Mansions, which was built by Victor Sassoon, who was one of the great industrialists in Shanghai. Here's the building recently. This was one of those 1930s skyscraper hotels, which was very famous, and then it was famous for its interior mosaic, Art Deco, and brass work. But unfortunately, a few years ago, one of the Chinese hotel groups modernized it and made it into, I'd say, your standard marble interior, and it lost its quality. But if you do go up to the top, they have overlook of the whole city. That's one of the many places where people would look at the great city from above. This is the oldest hotel, though, the Astor Hotel, which dates back to the 1850s and was the leading hotel in the city back when electricity was first installed in this hotel, and has many famous visitors, including Bertrand Russell and Ulysses S. Grant, and a whole parade of people used to stay when this was the only hotel in town that had things like plumbing and electricity. Now it has been just repaired and kept in original condition, and if you walk from the dock to the Bund, I recommend going in the lobby of this and looking at its, let's say, historic quality. Right across the street is this building, which is the Russian consulate, and that has been their building since the Tsarist time, and they still have it as the Russian consulate. You can see the Russian flag up there. It is surrounded by other towers, but both these buildings are among those that are preserved well in the Bund area of Shanghai. The Bund itself was a great landing for ships, and very crowded with traffic. The main commercial buildings were built along. You can walk along this now, but it has been turned into a great park, particularly because the Huangpu River is prone to some flooding and tidal surges like we might get from this storm. They've raised the level of the park so you actually step from the street up onto the park, and then you can go along this great promenade. This was the great face of the splendorous time of Shanghai when the Bund was the Paris of the East and was one of the most significant architectural cities in the world, and now it's being surrounded by a whole nother era of architecture. But the buildings on the Bund are preserved, and the park is usually crowded with many Chinese visitors. And then ourselves, we are always a drop of humanity in the great sea of Chinese. This particular time, this year, the Shanghai Expo is bringing 500,000 Chinese per day to come to Shanghai to visit the great World Expo. And so you'll see there are a lot of groups from all over China that are crowding up Shanghai to this day. And so get ready for seeing the great variety of China that are right there walking down the Bund. Now here's a view from the Pudong docks back to that Suzhou Creek and the Garden Bridge, and that's the Sassoon Hotel. But this is a view to the center of what used to be the center of town, still the historic heart of the town, where these buildings are still there. The Chartered Bank, the original Hong Kong Shanghai banking building is there. Many of them have changed hands because all these foreign interests were confiscated in 1949, and then now they were government offices or have been turned into other uses, but the buildings themselves have been preserved. This is the Shanghai Club, which was the Merchants Club back in the previous century, which was given over as the International Sailors Club. Back when I was sailing ships in and out of Shanghai, we could go there as sailors, show our seaman's card, and get in there and stay there. Now it has turned into the Waldorf Astoria East. It has been rebuilt as a fancy club, and it has beautiful big ballrooms and suites overlooking the harbor. The rate started $1,000 a day. Now it's just opened. And the long bar, the world's longest bar, it's over 120 feet long, has been rebuilt, and it's open for business. It's down on the south side of the Bund. If you walk along, you'll see a Waldorf Astoria sign. And this is what's going on in Shanghai, is they're taking some of these old buildings, this is a Hong Kong Shanghai Bank building, and then opening up again as heritage properties, and particularly trying to restore some of their features when they were the glory of the city. So this is just off the Bund. You can see the buildings are still being used. Now this city became an international, let's say, the collision and cooperation of the East and the West, and many merchant families from around China were founded in Shanghai as what they call compradors, being the buyers to bring in goods from the rest of China, then sell to the international companies and shipped it around the world, especially silk, tea, other manufactured goods finally. And what this did is it created a merchant class in China that did not really exist before. In the imperial medieval times, you were either in the nobility and in the educated literati who ran the country, but merchants were considered lower than farmers and other productive people. And trade went on, but it was not industrialized to the point where it made very wealthy families. And many of them ended up, let's say, becoming very prosperous and rich in Shanghai, and especially the women. And it's said that these women that were traditionally kept in the house and were not allowed to do anything were starting to get education, often via the foreigners and missionary schools, and then encouraged to go into business. And to this day now, Shanghai women are considered one of the strongest forces in the modernization of China, and some of them became quite wealthy. Many had to flee after the communist victory and ended up in Hong Kong or Taiwan or overseas. Madame Chiang Kai-shek and the other Sung sisters are particularly famous as the real leaders of China through that era. But then they became more mixed and internationalized. So here's a wedding portrait where they're dressed in sort of a mixed Western and Chinese-style clothing. See, the man has a fedora. And so the Shanghaiese have held a position in Chinese society as those who, maybe were corrupted by foreign influence, but they above all became entrepreneurs and bankers and industrialists that made modern China what it is. But on the other side of that, the poor of the nation, and especially the Shanghai area, were brought in to work in the textile mills, silk spinning factories, various handicrafts in the industrialization of China. And at a time when Shanghai was at its glory in the 1920s, it also had millions of very poor people working in sweatshops. And at the worst of it, when there was turmoil and war in the rest of China, there were many refugees to Shanghai where there was at least a modicum of work or protection. But in that era, they said there were up to 1,000 bodies a day that were picked up off the streets from starvation and also gang violence and all the crime and suffering that happened in Shanghai while it was also building up to its glory. And the worst problem was, of course, opium, which was brought in forcibly into China, and then it became the great national addiction until the communists banned it and replaced it with cigarettes, because Mao Zedong promoted smoking tobacco is better for you than opium. Well, anyway, Shanghai had a rather glorious and tawdry time at the 1920s and 30s. You can see that Empire of the Sun and a number of other Shanghai movies that have been made recently to recreate it. This building was the most famous sing-song house because it had restaurants on the ground floor, opium dens upstairs, and then private quarters where you could spend the whole day and night and evening and all day long being entertained in all the ways you possibly wanted. So this is a cartoon of the era, the scale of the pleasure houses that Shanghai was famous for. Now it is merely a shopping mall where you can only buy knockoff Rolexes or something. But this is the great contrast to Shanghai. You had the race course, which no Chinese were allowed into, which is now the People's Square, and then you had incredible poverty and desperation right nearby. And that's why the Communist Party was actually founded in Shanghai, to liberate the country from the imperialists and all of that. But nonetheless, some of the great houses of the industrialists are there. This is the Sassoon Villa outside of town, and then this was the home of Madame Song Qingling, who was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the People's Republic. This became a children's palace later and a school building, but it's an example of the kind of villas which still exist. Now I'm going to just show you a few of the Shanghai people, because it's really, ultimately it's about the people here, not just the architecture. So briefly, Mei Langfeng was the famous opera singer who traveled around the world around 1890 to 1900 and made Chinese opera known to the world, Peking opera. And then here, Yong Yiren is an industrial. He was called the Red Capitalist, who as a Communist Party member from Shanghai proposed that the state be an entrepreneur and build industry. And he's been credited with making the form of, let's say, national socialism and entrepreneurship that China has today, starting in Shanghai. Chen Yi was a general along with Zhu De and Mao Zedong, and a victor in, of course, the Chinese Civil War, and then later was a mayor of Shanghai. But Song Qingling, who was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, was the the greatest woman in the last century in Shanghai, and she proposed the compromise with the nationalists and the communists to prevent the civil war. But when it broke out anyway, she broke off with her sister, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalists, and the compromise was not made, and it's still a problem to this day. But then more modern figures are, of course, Yao Ming, the great basketball player who was just back with the Houston Rockets playing in Shanghai and around the country, making the biggest audience for basketball nowadays is in China. And then this other guy, Han Han, he's a race car Formula One driver who's also a blogger and a celebrity and a critic of the government, but because he's a sports figure, he gets away with it. But anyway, these are some of the Shanghai people. The most famous in literature, though, is this man, Lu Xun, who was a poet and a writer and a critic of Shanghai at the time, but he was finally executed by the Japanese, and his tomb is outside of Shanghai to this day. But anybody who studies Chinese literature always ends up reading Lu Xun as a great modern writer of Shanghai. Well, what happened, as you know, is the Japanese attacked North China. They came down, and then they bombed mercilessly in Shanghai, and then drove all the foreigners out, imprisoned many people, built concentration camps out of town, and damaged a lot of the buildings in Shanghai, and then continued their conquest up the Yangzi River Valley. Then the communists came in. When I was a young Red Guard with my friend Mao, we used to go and check out the pleasure houses in Shanghai and shut them down one after the other. But anyway, the communists came in, and they felt Shanghai was a den of iniquity and a source of pollution for the Chinese nation, and so the communists actually left Shanghai as it was. They didn't build anything new. They took all of the money out of the industry and invested it around the country, and so then Shanghai sort of stayed in a limbo for many, many decades, including many of the old buildings were just run down. Now this one they were thinking of saving, but I believe it's now torn down. They have saved quite a bit of the old European-style architecture, but a lot of it's just in the way of the next big tower. But as you walk around in the old town, you'll see still some of the old theaters and some of the remnants of the days when all these signs would have been in French and English and German, whatever they may have been. But this is Nanjing Road, the main commercial road off of the Bund, which is now a pedestrian walkway. When I first came in, it was choked with bicycles and buses, and you could hardly get around the town. Now the city has a new subway, and they've made walking areas, so it's actually very easy to get around Shanghai these days. Here's a building that has just reopened. This is the old British consulate right next to the bridge, and it is now part of the Peninsula Hotel that has built a new hotel right next to it. And this is their function hall. So I recommend you just, as you walk over that bridge, you'll see this building in a 2 or 3 acre park, and is now reopened to the public and is an example of historic preservation in Shanghai. The most famous of the hotels, though, is the Peace Hotel, originally the Cathay Hotel, and this was one of the first skyscraper hotels built in the early 1920s with beautiful Art Deco interior. It's very, very big, and it used to be the only place that had good accommodations to stay in the city. Many famous people have stayed there. And if you go up onto the top roof, there are restaurants and, again, an overlook of the city. Because of so many crowds of Chinese in town, they actually have guards outside. They don't let any of the Chinese tourists in, but they will let us in if you want to go walk through the glorious lobby there. Well, this is the view to the new side of town, Pudong, across the river. And it literally means the east side of the Huangpu River. That's where the name Pudong is, Dong being east. And the great TV tower. And then the new financial district where they are now building these incredible buildings. And so if you go across there, you'll see you're in a completely different century from the other side of the river. And there is a couple of tours. There are a couple that go up the Jinmao Tower to look at this area and get an overlook of the city. But these days, the biggest news is the expo, and this is the little gimpy little blue guy his name is Haibao, or the treasure of the ocean. And this is part of the promotion of the expo, which is very important to the city of Shanghai and also to all of China that they host this great fair. Now, they've been building the city at a kind of a furious rate for quite a while, especially highways. They've cleared out a lot of the congestion in the city, built these overleafs, and some of them are quite fantastic. This sign says we promote the 4 developments of China and Shanghai, which means we want to have ever greater transportation to build it says there, build a modern international socialist city, which in other words means a traffic jam to me. But here it is. You'll see these great flyovers, and this was put up in the last 10 or 20 years. What it has allowed, though, is to build parks underneath the highways, making this a very green city and helping the air pollution content and having places where, even though the buildings are high and there's a lot of congestion, you also have a lot of space to go around on the ground nowadays. It's not the dense city that it used to be, even if it's bigger than ever. So you see a lot of parks, a lot of art, a lot of modern construction. This is right as where we dock. And this used to be a rough industrial dock when I first came in, and now it's become a green and a pleasant landing for the ship. And so the city has this maritime heritage, which is represented by this fantastic topiary, again, right near where we're landing. But in the center of the city, as I say, off Nanjing Road and the Bund, there are some remnants of Chinese architecture, but the old houses are still sometimes there, and these are vanishing neighborhoods, some of which have been preserved just because they have a quality different than living in a giant apartment house. So you'll see if you walk around in the neighborhoods, you'll come from one tremendous skyscraper, then you'll go back and see these what they call the Longtao, or the little lanes where people live in little packed houses. Often they were factory accommodations for their workers. The conditions have been very poor in them, but sometimes they'll save the facade and build new quarters behind. But here's some of the neighborhoods that you'll still see. Many of them have been torn out. There have been about 600,000 individual housing units that have been replaced in the city, and most people have been moved out to new suburban areas. But you'll still see alleyways with people crowded in, and as they say, with the laundry out. That's the national flag. And there's a lot of street life, a lot of food, again, sort of dim sum style dining on the street. And then a lot of people still come from the countryside and do menial labor and work in the construction site. So even though the city is sort of made for the wealthy and the powerful, there's a lot of people who still come to Shanghai for hard work and survival, selling here sugarcane, for instance, in the neighborhood. And so this whole neighborhood right here, this is right where we dock now. This is all completely gone, and all these people were given a notice to get up and move out. And so a lot of the housing, of course, was not very good to begin with, but many of them have gone out to modern facilities, even though they like their old neighborhood. But the problem is they often had only one water tap to share between a dozen families, a common toilet, common kitchen often. And so this has all been torn out now, and you'll see it's still going on, that the old Shanghai is being replaced by the new modern city. But I was walking in this area, and these women were driven out of their house to new housing, but every day they'd come back to sit in the rubble of their neighborhood just to catch up because they kind of dispersed away. And this is one of the problems of modern China, because the density of the housing previously meant everybody knew everybody and everybody's business, but they also had a, let's say, more traditional family structure, and now they have atomized the family. You only have one child, and you're living in a high apartment house, but you have your typical urban alienation versus the old neighborhood. So this woman refused to leave, and I've seen this happen in China, where often the elders are the ones, I've been here all my life, I don't want to go out, and often they have no other family to help them. And so she was complaining that she'd have to go. Now a lot of this transformation of Shanghai means you have neighborhoods that are about to be demolished, but they'll still set up a whole market. And in this case, they're selling all of the fake goods that are coming out of the workshops of the area. So this was a poster, striking forbid illegal management activities of soliciting guests. And that translates better in Chinese, but what it means is you're going to be offered Rolex watches until you think that you can get them 4 for $10. And at that rate, you could really go into business, but you'll be hustled by various people selling you what they call politely in Chinese watery goods, meaning they're all knockoffs. And these watches, they look good, but they're guaranteed not to tell time. I only invest in fake Timexes myself. But anyway, there's a lot of young people in town, a lot of nightclubs, a lot of shopping, and it's sort of the boom of China can be seen in Shanghai, including in places like this, where they kind of melding soy soy sauce on the hamburgers with that, of course, that famous fish sauce called ketchup. And so Shanghai is this tremendous city booming, and here's a plan right where we're docking to build yet again the biggest building in the world if the mud can hold it up. And you'll go around and see a lot of construction projects. But the technology is quite remarkable, some of the, particularly the building technology. But this is one thing you may visit. This is the Maglev train to the airport, which is the first operational magnetic levitation train. It does not go downtown. You have to go out to an area of Pudong where it ends the line. They have built this great terminal. And then you get on the train, which is nothing particular as a modern high-speed train, except that it has no wheels. It picks up by magnetism and goes zooming along like you feel like you're on an airplane. And then suddenly it's going this fast, 431 kilometers an hour. Takes you about 8 minutes to go the 15 kilometers it is to the airport. And the thing basically starts up and then it coasts all the way back. And then suddenly you're at the airport. So it's a test case. They're planning to build that line to Beijing and other areas if they can clear the way. Meanwhile, the city has built a subway system, and notice they have the rental bike, so if you want, you can go just put some coins in and rent a bike to go around town. So Shanghai is sort of on the leading edge of transportation technology, trying to make this formerly congested city most accessible. Here's some of the new skyscrapers that are being built. And the Grand Theater, which is a tremendous building with opera and musicals and film and things. Here's the Jinmao Tower, which has the world's highest hotel in it. And there's an 83rd floor observation deck. You can go up and see it. This is looking from the observation deck down into the hotel, which if you think you get dizzy on the deck of this ship, that's really scary. But it's a tremendous hotel. It was actually Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill designed. Now this one is the Mori Tower, which is a Japanese design, and they call it, though, the bottle opener for obvious reasons. But Mr. Mori of the Sony Group and construction, he wanted a round top to be more oriental, but the local Shanghai people said that looks too much like the Japanese flag, so they squared him off. But that's not quite open yet at the top, but it's the latest new building in town. I do recommend going in here. This is the Shanghai Museum, the historical museum, the national one, which is designed after a traditional cauldron, which is one of their prize collection of a bronze cauldron from about 4,000 years ago. And so they designed the building to sort of echo that traditional Chinese shape. Then they have archaeology, calligraphy, painting, and currently they have a Catherine the Great exhibit if you like Russian art. But here's an example of the classical painting with the clouds and the blankness of the rice paper lens perspective and distance in this mountain scene up the Yangzi River. And so I recommend going to that museum. There are also a lot of modern art collections. Here's the former racetrack tower, which is now turned into the Museum of Contemporary Art right off the main square near the Shanghai Museum. But anywhere you go in town, you'll see a lot of public art, especially for the expo. They've dressed up the city and they made it more beautiful and more dramatic. This is the world's largest sundial, which really works very well if it's not too smoggy. And here's the Oriental Art Museum. So there's a lot to see in this town. Just a couple of days is just a taste of it. But curiously, even in the middle of all the skyscrapers, here's one of the oldest, Jing'an Buddhist temple, which in the prosperity of Shanghai has built this tremendous Nepalese-style stupa on top. So even the Buddhists are doing well these days. But people are coming here to see the expo, which is on the south side of the city, former rail yards and industrial area, with all these many exhibits. And again, 500,000 people are there a day. If you go to your national pavilion with your passport, you can get in without a line. But of course, most of the visitors are Chinese to see these modern wonders like the UK pavilion, the pincushion, and you see the crowds. A lot of the displays are visual and very dramatic media, but I think Tom Sitton told me that he likes the African pavilions because they actually have people playing music and talking to them, whereas many of these others are purely technological. The China Pavilion features the largest solar panel roof in the world and other examples of the future. This is the China Pavilion, this tremendous sort of reinvention of the classical mortise temple structure, which was traditionally meant it could withstand earthquakes and typhoons by this heavy roof and this combined strength that comes up from the ground. This is very much the newest symbol for Shanghai. And at night it's lit up, and this is the glory of the town to go see the expo if you can. I personally have been going to see other things in town because I didn't come to Shanghai to see anything but Shanghai. One of the tours goes to this urban planning center with this sort of golden gilded version of the city, and then there's a big model of the whole city on a whole floor, and quite a beautiful display of what they're planning to build. So if they've already built this in our last couple of decades, imagine what they're going to be doing in the future with the kind of design and command economy and the capital that they have. So Shanghai is very much the showcase in a tremendous city that, especially at night, they light up. This is the old Garden Bridge over Suzhou Creek. And you can go out and take a dragon boat if you think that you think this boat is bumpy. Go on and go riding on a dragon. But this is on right near where I talk, and I took this picture because it sort of is a motto for this great city. And with that, I'll just leave you the night view. We do have a couple of nights here. We have the pleasure of walking into town and getting to know this remarkable city. And with that, I just say welcome to Shanghai, and I look forward to seeing you there as soon as we get there. Thank you very much, and have a good trip there.